Gentle rocking of the microphone on the table. That's quite nice. Welcome, everybody. Okay, first thing it says here is, introduce myself. I am not Nikolai, which I'm not. I'm not Nikolai Duffy. I'm Martin Kratz. I'm the program manager here at Manchester Poetry Library. Nikolai sends his apologies. When I realized he wouldn't be able to make it, I requested that I do this because I've been a big fan of JT's work for a long time, and I'll go into that in a little bit. But that's the first thing. I'm not Nikolai. Okay, some housekeeping. There isn't any no fire alarms are planned. So if there is a fire alarm, please go to All Saints Park. The second thing is toilets are just as you go outside the Poetry Library on your right, and there's also a drinking fountain there. And, you know, if at any time you need to leave, the door is open. You can leave and come back in as you wish. Given the subject today, I've provided some additional information sheets at the table, which Student Services provided me with. It's really comprehensive, it's really good, and I printed enough for everyone because I think it's information that everyone should have if you haven't already got it. So please do pick one up. I think it's really valuable, and they've done a really good job in putting it together. And also just to say that I'm a mental health first aider here at Manchester Met, so if anyone needs to talk, come find me. Right, introductions. This is the bit. I'm going to do the official introduction, which is reading what other people and possibly yourself have written about you, and then I'm going to do my bit, which is what I really think of you. Yeah.
All right, in that order, okay.
In that order, yeah, okay. So in his own words, JT is a writer and academic based in York. He mostly writes and thinks about creativity, literature, the liberal arts, the creative industries, pop culture, digital culture, and other things that humans make. He's the author of several books of poetry, including The Ruin, Hell Creek Anthology, Waterloo, Orchids, and also a poetry anthology, which he co-edited with, I don't know how to pronounce Agnes's last name.
Lehóczky.
Ágnes Lehóczky, thank you. Wretched Strangers, Borders, Movements, Homes, both, which if you're a member of Manchester Poetry Library, you can walk away with today for free. He's also the author of The Selling and Self-Regulation of Contemporary Poetry, which was published in 2020. He's published articles and chapters on 20th century American poets, including William Carlos Williams, T.S. Eliot, John Berryman, and Elizabeth Bishop, with a focus on poets' essays, letters, and manifestos. He's the director for the Centre for Modern Studies at York, and co-director of Thin Ice Press. Now, my take. That sounds like I'm going to undo all of this, but it isn't. I remember first seeing well, I don't know if this is the first time I saw it, but kind of like seeing you, I don't know why I'm stalling on this.
In action.
In action, yeah. And we have photographic evidence of this, which is quite funny. At the 3rd Contemporary British and Irish Poetry Conference at University of Manchester in 2013. Was anyone else there? I don't know. This is, okay, it was one of us. Okay. It was an event. Actually, in retrospect, it was quite a wild event because Seamus Heaney was billed to be there, and he died the week before, and everyone and all his and there were all his friends were there at this conference, and it was very strange. And in this kind of strangeness, JT gave a paper called The Generation Game, Cohort Making Contemporary British Poetry, and I genuinely think it changed the way I saw poetry criticism and how you could write about writing. It was doubled down by a later conference where I saw him, and he did a paper called What's So Funny About Beefs, Bad Blood and Misunderstanding, the Fear of Factions in Contemporary UK Poetry, which I think might be worth revisiting currently. It was, the fact that in the second title there's a certain irreverence about it, but it was something about critical distance, which is something I'm sort of skeptical of, and I think there's also, I'll commit as far as saying there's an anxiety about that, I think, in your own writing, and we'll talk about that, what critical distance is, whether it's even possible. but also what it means. I mean, JT is also a poet, so what happens if you're writing about this thing? what happens if you're part of this mess that you're writing about? And how do you entangle or double up the two? And I just remember that, and I was really kind of like, oh, okay, this is also a way to do it. And so, yeah, and I think the key thing I've taken away from your work is this thing about, and this really comes through in this one as well, is that it's not so much about the telling, but kind of what the telling says about us. So whether we're talking about generationalism in generations, people saying this is this generation. I think we were thinking about like next generation schemes and things like that as well. What these stories we say about it, or whether it's about poetry and suicide, what we're saying about it, what does that actually say about us? And that's kind of where the thing that for me links your work together. And this introduction will come to an end at some point. But I think it's really resonant now, and it kind of, and it's sort of adjacent to my own interests, and I'm going to pick this up just at the end, which is I'm really interested in poets who stopped writing in their own lifetime. And again, first it was like, why would you do that? But actually what was more interesting is what are the stories we're telling about them? What are we saying? How are we explaining the fact that people stopped doing this thing that they love so much? And what do they do instead? But that doesn't matter. What it matters is why are they doing it? So, kind of what's our investment in the story, and what does it say about me and the wider culture that I'm part of? And for this book, and I'll talk about it a little bit more in a minute, but I think the way Francesca Bratton describes it as a manifesto against closure, which I really like. As close as a summary goes, that for me is the kind of perfect summary for the book, which is really impressive because it's a hard book to summarize, but if you're going to summarize it, that's the one. I think it's absolutely brilliant. So we're going to start, I think, with a reading, right?
Yeah, I mean, thank you.
If you want, unless you want to respond to anything you want to say.
I was just going to say thank you, Martin, and to everybody for coming out, and to Manchester University Press for, this book has been on a journey, like, in lots of different ways. It took a long time to even, like, allow myself to consider writing, and then a very long time to write in lots of different forms, and I'm similar. I never know how to kind of describe it. It is partly literary history. It's about poets who died by suicide, mostly in the 20th century, from all different parts of the world. But it's also threaded through with kind of memoir and personal stories. So that kind of like that way you described it. It's so nice to hear that kind of, because I do think about that kind of distance all the time, and that sense of how you position yourself in a topic all the time. And there are times where in my day job as an academic where I feel like that's, you're not supposed to be doing that. You have to kind of maintain a critical distance, or whether you're teaching or whether you're doing research, and that it's, you have an object and you're studying it in a certain way. But I'm always, a bit skeptical of that, or I think there are good ways of doing that, but to me, like, this was a project that started with language, and that's such an obvious thing to say as a poet and with people who are interested in poetry, but that language is that weird thing that we carry around. We have it personally, it's in our heads, it's all we have to describe ourselves or what we do, but it's also not ours, it's like public. And that's where, I don't know, just to kind of give a bit of an origin story, it was a kind of recognition of a gap of some kind in the public language around suicide, and my own personal experiences of it in my family. Like I said, I work as I teach literature, poetry, creative writing, and that's one side of me. That's maybe a public side of me. But my family, we've had lots of suicide in my family, going back generations. Like, long before I was born. It's a kind of there's a sort of family language there. There's a kind of personal language there. But it's also a topic where the language in public is like really we talk about that language a lot, and it's kind of controlled in certain ways. There are media guidelines about what we're supposed to say or not say about it as a topic, and and even the guidance you're talking about for really good reasons to kind of think about the consequences and the care we take with language. But when my sister died in 2016, I really felt that gap, that idea that there's this language around prevention, and it's full of statistics and kind of emphasis on risks and a kind of medical kind of perspectives and things. But like, I'm just trying to process this in terms of, I know, in a better world, it wouldn't have happened, but it did happen. And now how can I talk to myself, and how can, within the family or with others, how do we talk about this? And so I just turned to poetry in desperation, really, of kind of like, I need to find a new language. And that was where it was just finding one poet after another to kind of fill that gap and to think about different ways of circling around this topic. And I don't know if other people had that experience, but that is that public and that private thing, like you're saying. So maybe I will start by reading a bit, right, if it's not too weird, right from the middle of the book, because I think it touches on some of these things. We can talk more, like the book is structured. There are a few chapters at the beginning that lay out my sort of, a kind of theory of poetry and suicide, and we can talk more about that, an idea that suicide is something that we read like poetry. It has an author, it has readers. But in the middle of the book, there are 3 chapters that kind of look at different stages of life. So a chapter about suicide in young people, and then later suicide in later life. But right in the middle, there's this book, chapter called Suicide in the Family, and it's about generations. I guess I hadn't really even made that connection, but thinking about how things are passed through different traumas and the different stories that we tell. So I'll read a bit from that, because that'll give you a flavor of how the personal and the stuff goes back and forth. Okay. In 2001, like most years of its long run, the Oprah Winfrey Show aired a Mother's Day special. At the start, a vibrant graphic with the words, "Mother's Day Surprise-a-rama," whirls onto the screen as Oprah's familiar voice teases. You're gonna laugh, you're gonna cry, you're gonna wanna call your mother. The episode then follows a classic talk show gotcha format. 3 mothers in the audience, each under the impression that they are there for different topics, are called to sit beside Oprah. After poignant pre-recorded messages from their children, each mother's segment concludes with the children themselves appearing from backstage for tearful hugs. One of these mothers was mine. The year before, my mom had written a letter to Real Simple magazine. After expressing her gratitude for the comfort she took from their tips and stories about other women's lives, it was typical of my gregarious mother to share details about our large mixed family and the joy we found in simple things following my aunt's suicide. A rupture that brought 2 cousins into our household and indirectly led to my parents' messy divorce. My mom is an infectious storyteller, so I don't think any of us were too shocked when someone from Real Simple magazine got in touch. A writer and photographer flew from New York to follow my mom around our small Midwestern town for a few days, and the feature was published in November of 2000. Whatever the local busybodies thought when the issue hit the grocery store checkout bearing the headline, "One Woman's Triumph," we assumed our 15 minutes of very minor fame had passed. But a few months later, a producer from Oprah phoned me at university and made secret travel arrangements for us to gather at the studio in Chicago. In the episode, once Oprah has my startled mother in her grasp, she cues a montage showing the devastating tragedy that shaped our lives. Sentimental piano music accompanies old photographs of my mom, her sister, and the 2 cousins who became my sisters. 14 years prior, Oprah's voiceover explains, my aunt left a note asking my mother to take care of her children. Then my sister Sarah appears, saying that she and my sister Beth, sitting beside her in the video, quote, are here today to honor the mother figure in our lives on Mother's Day. In the picture-in-picture, my mom smiles through tears as Beth recounts how she helped them cope with their loss, with the loss of their mother, when Beth was 10 and Sarah was 7, helping them thrive in their new family. Beth says, I don't know how she couldn't have been overwhelmed by the responsibility and the emotions. You know, she had just lost her sister just like we had lost our mother, and I'm sure that she struggled with her own feelings. But she always put us first and foremost. When the video ends, Oprah invites Beth and Sarah from the wings, then continues ramping up the tears and applause as she brings my stepdad from the audience and my other siblings and me from backstage. The entire segment lasts around 7 minutes. Although it mainly repeats the story and some of the language from the magazine article in a TV-friendly format, at the time it was the most thrilling thing any of us could imagine. Being picked up by a limo at the airport, being fitted with mics backstage, and meeting the most famous woman in the world on a show watched religiously by millions. Yet these days, none of us mentions it, even to close friends. When I asked my mom if she could email the video clip, neither of us had watched it in years. 6 months after we all grinned from Oprah's sofa, and a little over a year after our glossy photos appeared in Real Simple magazine, my sister Sarah attempted suicide for the first time. The happy family from those images suddenly felt like a bitter lie. As I watched the Oprah segment for the first time since Sarah died in 2016, she seems as confident and charming as she was in life, a natural star on camera. As many people find after a suicide, this dissonance between her public vibrancy and private misery is heartbreaking. As the years pass, it becomes harder and harder to disentangle the many retellings of my aunts and sisters' deaths from the reality they left us with. Suicidal behavior runs in families, writes the psychologist Thomas Joyner, citing evidence for the role played by genetics and neurobiology. Yet the idea of suicide's inheritability is older than those modern scientific fields. As Joyner points out, Robert Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy, published in 1621, imagines suicidal melancholy being passed on in the form of black bile. By 1840, Forbes Winslow asserted in The Anatomy of Suicide, quote, with reference to suicide, there is no fact that has been more clearly established than that of its hereditary character. Recent research has shed more light on what is referred to as suicidal transmission between generations, with some studies suggesting that children of parents who have attempted or completed suicide are 2 to 3 times more likely to exhibit suicidal behaviors themselves. Some present evidence for the genetic basis of that transmission. Studies of identical twins and adopted children, for instance, show an elevated risk for biological relatives. Others highlight the interplay of factors, not only hereditary factors, but also environmental influences, such as psychosocial circumstances and family dynamics. In his classic 1938 study, Man Against Himself, Carl Menninger writes that, quote, there is no convincing scientific evidence that the suicidal impulse is hereditary, and there is much psychoanalytic evidence to show that these cases of numerous suicides in one family may be explained on a psychological basis. A contemporary textbook on suicidology finds a middle ground. Quote, suicidal behaviors are too complex for there to ever be a single suicide gene, but genes can be related to suicide risk factors. As with most things, an inclination towards suicide appears to be an unknowable combination of nature and nurture. So I begin this chapter by suggesting that the idea of suicidal inheritance may be as readily inherited as any genetic predisposition. Like biological or environmental factors, the transmission of stories and language around suicidal inheritance has serious consequences for how we read suicide. I have lived with stories of suicide all my life. The deaths of my sister, aunt, stepfather, step-grandfather, great-grandmother, and 2 cousins might make a useful case study for the family clusters that fascinate suicide researchers. These losses have also taught me how family history shapes the meaning of individual deaths. Even one suicide in the family can feel like a strange secret, and the poets I discuss in this chapter show how family mythologies can expand into something like a curse or fate. For these writers, ideas of suicidal inheritance become a matter of life and death. In every family, we pass on stories as much as genes. For many readers, the poets in this chapter will be some of the best known in this book. Among them, Sylvia Plath is the first poet many think of when poetry and suicide are mentioned together. Cultural associations between poetry and suicide are often linked to a group of mid-century American poets around Plath, sometimes known as the confessionalist school. The term comes from a review of Robert Lowell's 1959 collection, Life Studies, a book that proved hugely influential in its bold treatment of personal experience. Robert Lowell didn't die by suicide, but Sylvia Plath and Anne Sexton, who met on a poetry course taught by Lowell at Boston University, along with John Berryman and Randall Jarrell, 2 other poets associated with confessionalism, all ended their lives between 1963 and 1974. Each of these writers vehemently rejected the label confessional, yet their unflinching and inventive approaches to autobiographical verse changed American poetry forever, just as their deaths became permanently intertwined with the mythology around this literary movement. I'm using the word mythology here not to imply a falseness in these narratives, but to emphasize the power of stories and communal retellings in the reception of these poets. Some readers or scholars criticize the supposedly gossipy interest in these poets' lives and deaths, or the supposedly narcissistic nature of their writing, but it might be more helpful to think of this group of poets as serial self-mythologizers. Their poetic self-myths are less a matter of ego than a desire to situate their experiences within larger meanings. For these poets, family mythologies are central to the search for self-meaning. Plath, Berryman, Sexton, and Jarrell are connected by a powerful sense that stories of self are not only inherited from previous generations and passed on to future ones, but remade in each retelling. On one level, the confessionalist fixations on intergenerational family trauma are undoubtedly inspired by Freud and their personal experiences of psychoanalysis. But it's also hard to separate their poetry, particularly that of Plath, Berryman, and Sexton, from the growing public status of poets in the US and the UK in the 1960s. As new prizes, academic positions, and other forms of recognition open new possibilities for working as a professional creative writer. Poetry's new visibility afforded these writers a degree of literary fame that we can still see in the circulation of magazine-style photographs. Blonde Sylvia Plath in her bathing suit, John Berryman with his Whitman-esque beard, and Anne Sexton's cocktail party glamour. These images are emblematic of the mythologies around these writers, mythologies neither wholly invented nor wholly inherited. After John F. Kennedy was murdered in November 1963, the United States spent a turbulent decade trying to understand its place in the world. This chapter is about poets' search for meaning following Sylvia Plath's suicide in February of that year, and how often this search revolved around the place of trauma in their families. So I'll leave it there for now. That gives you some sense.
Thank you. I think I wanted to say to those who haven't read it, and I think your reading gives a really good sense of this, that I felt in very safe hands reading this book. And and it was, and I think that's really important to say. That's kind of like it felt, you know, and I think you can tell from what was happening there, and you've given so much there that I think I'm not sure where to start, but I think what really stuck out was you contacting your mother at the beginning of the chapter. And I'm sort of skipping to the end of the book here, but you sort of identify poetry as being interpersonal in the book. So contrary to this image of, you say that poetry and suicide are fundamentally interpersonal acts. And you make a link to people who've theorized suicide, often actually linking the very image of the poet on their own, then to people who died by suicide. And so it's this kind of narrative of isolation, actually, versus this interpersonal. And I was also thinking that actually that's reflected in your method, or how you've done the book felt interpersonal to me, which also perhaps is away from the story we tell about academics working on their, do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I hadn't thought of it in that way, but yeah, it is, first of all, that sense of this a kind of a stereotype, really, of poets being these lonely, isolated kind of characters grappling with these, and it's not a stereotype that's completely untrue, but there's a social aspect, like, because you wouldn't write the words down, you wouldn't make that appeal to language if it wasn't about connecting. And it was a slow kind of realization of like the parallels between that and what happens with suicide, that we think of it as this kind of the loneliest kind of death, you know, this kind of very isolating thing, but actually there's something in it that is a kind of reaching out, or there's something in it that, you know, if we think of it as a death which has a kind of author, which is a complicated thing, and to kind of think about the death of the author in the sense that we can't know what their intentions were, we can't know what they were thinking, whether they left a note or whatever the circumstances are, but there is, by definition, some kind of intent. It is an action that they have taken, that we become the reader, and we have this, you know, and we can keep reading and keep rereading, and it feels like, yeah, that those parallels, I hadn't seen those. Like, it took me a long time to kind of realize that process of the way that I read poetry and the connection that you're trying to find in the poet without ever knowing exactly what they were intending, or, you know, and that openness, like not closure, not kind of get to the bottom line, like, yes, this is what the poet meant, and but to kind of be open that on a different day you might reread the poem totally differently. And that there was this moment, yeah, it was a kind of slow light bulb turning on over years, even, of like, this is how I felt in kind of grief, that this is, you just keep mulling the thing over, you come back and you reread it and you're finding different details. When some days you're angry and some days you're just sad beyond language, and other days you're kind of, you feel guilt, or you feel all kinds of different things. And it is interpersonal. I think that connection to the process was something that was, it's what made it possible to keep writing the thing. I mean, like, you know, there were many times where I was like, I can't do this. I can't finish this. I can't even begin this. But talking to people about this project and this topic, this funny thing would happen where it was almost like a weird kind of like morbid parlor game, where they would say, which poets are you writing about? And I'd say, well, Plath, you know, and other well-knowns, and I'm interested in this one. And they would say, well, what about this one? And they were suggesting people, and so many, there are 25 or more poets, and I got as many in here as I could, and I'm sure some people will open the book and kind of say, where's Hart Crane, or where's Charlotte Miu, or where's, you know, Yukio Mishima? I'm sorry I couldn't get everybody, but there was this growing spreadsheet, and it felt really like collaborative. It felt like people were telling me, oh, you haven't heard of this poet from this other part of the world. They've never been translated in English, but they have this amazing story. And that, to me, was like, it was so much part of the process. And it made it possible, yeah, to kind of keep stitching together. And, you know, when you read it, I'm never talking about a single poet in isolation. It's always like comparing them to another one and another one. And there's this kind of chain of, like, you know, showing just how diverse suicide is, really, like at different time periods, different parts of the world.
Because actually in those chapters you sort of lean into, well, there are times where you kind of look at it, okay, so you'll be looking at a poet and thinking about, for instance, the political context of, or historical context of someone's death, and that you can't separate them. And for someone else, you'd be looking at a different element, like the kind of intergenerational thing when you look at the confessional poets. But then actually, those categories are never steady. They're quickly, you're kind of like, well, actually, it's totally artificial to say these are political deaths, and Sylvia Plath, by contrast, isn't, because actually it also is, and that these things are, and that these categories are, they're a kind of starting point, helpful, but they quickly break down.
Yeah, and I think that to me was the kind of, like, that was the starting point of, like, I know poetry, and I was sort of going to poetry because it felt natural, but seeing poetry as this space where kind of like all bets are off about, like, what are the rules of language and the different kinds of language. If there is this public space where, you know, for good reasons, like we're really conscious about the care that we take with language around suicide, that within a poem, you know, it might be political, yeah, or philosophical, or more personal, or it might be, you know, humorous, or it might be all kinds of different things that we think in other spaces, you know, we need to separate these strands. And that was yeah, like, that was really revelatory, like, with some of these poets, just the tone, you know, as they're working through and processing and thinking about this stuff, it was clear that they saw the poem as a space in which, like, a different kind of thinking could happen, a different kind of language could happen. Yeah.
I was, when you were saying about people kind of suggesting people, there's a really distinct sense for me, like, going through the book, that I kind of looked at the names and I was kind of like, well, who's in here? I didn't play like bingo, like, these are the people I think should be in here. And but I was kind of going in, and then the ones I went, of course, and then, oh, really? And there were others who I was like, oh. And it was interesting to me then how far, for some, the suicide becomes part of their story that we tell about them, and others it doesn't, in the same way. And that was really interesting to me. Like,
yeah, it's true, that kind of that question of how it sort of dominates or not, like, the way that we read. I mean, the elephant in the room with that is the Sylvia Plath. And I mean, I don't know if people, you know, just in the past week, we've had this brilliant new edition of Sylvia Plath's collected poems, amazing, like, feat of kind of academic research, getting all this archival material and stuff. But again, when I've, you know, been reading reviews and seeing people talking about it, there's again this question of, like, you know, almost like it's a kind of binary of, like, oh, we don't want Sylvia Plath just to be, like, defined by her death. And it's like, oh, of course not. But then the idea to go the other way, so that's not talk about the biographical stuff, that's just focus on the language. And it sort of thinks there are different ways of reading, and that's something I was really interested in. I mean, I don't know whether it's a model, but it was one I was thinking of, was this book that a lot of people will know. Al Alvarez has a book called The Savage God, A Study in Suicide. It was published in 1971, and it is, as far as I know, that's until this is the most recent book about poetry and suicide. And it's a fascinating book, and it's still popular, partly because it is this kind of messy, potentially kind of problematic thing. It's very sensational. He very much is reading Sylvia Plath's poetry through her death, partly because he had a really close relationship, no one's quite sure how close, with her, and he's writing about that experience and his own experiences of a suicide attempt, as well as having this history. And I was thinking about exactly that kind of thing of how do you avoid kind of going to one extreme or the other of, like, you know, and I've had that, you know, with students, you know, wanting to, you know, every time I'm going to teach someone like Sylvia Plath, and it's like, how do I do this where that's not the whole conversation, that doesn't define it, but we have to talk about it because it's there in the work, it's there, you know, there are lots of poems I'm sure you all can think of where, you know, Plath or people like Mayakovsky or others that I talk about, where they're talking about suicide, and they're it's on their mind. You know, someone like John Berryman, it's like it's his whole project is his response to his father's death when he's younger, and it's finding some way of not feeling like it has to be all or nothing with that.
Well, I think that's also happening there in that kind of, in the approach you've taken, like I said, that the combination of the kind of historical and then the personal, which you are also then kind of sort of looking at from a historical perspective as well, like kind of what's going on now or what's going on in that moment kind of globally. And that actually, and the other upshot, the other side of that is looking at a kind of literary history, but remembering the actual human beings at the ends of these poems, and that you can treat them as such. I don't know why, you know, I sort of often started thinking about the workshop, the poetry workshop, and where this kind of finds, for me, one of its most extreme sort of expressions is in a type of poetry workshop where craft is so emphasized that you're able to, someone will bring a poem that might discuss suicide, and you get through it by just talking about form. And that's, for me, the kind of extreme of that, where, you know, that where you sort of forget, well, there's a person here, and there is actually a conversation had beyond it. And it doesn't necessarily mean, I don't know, like you said, it doesn't necessarily mean the polar opposite of that, but there needs to be some sort of, I don't know, negotiation of both.
And I think, I mean, I guess I really felt that in terms of like the search for like form, like with a book like this. And I was, you know, I think we're living in a kind of golden age of people messing with these kinds of forms and these questions. Like there are all these, you know, brilliant writers, you know, who you can think of and kind of mixing up the kind of critical and the creative, people like Maggie Nelson and Sheila Heti and Olivia Lang, and or someone like Claudia Rankine, and kind of like, is this poetry, and doing things, and people are reading this stuff, and they're kind of like, whatever label you want to put on it, that's fine. And I think that and that to me was like, that's exciting, but it's also then in practice to actually have to write and to figure out, well, okay, but how is this gonna work? And I mean, you could probably even hear in that bit I read that it's a little bit about, for me, it's the movement back and forth. There are these little kind of chunks or strands, and then it kind of weaves in and out. And it was only like last week I was chatting to someone, they were like, oh, I went to this workshop and we were talking about the braided essay. And I was like, the braided essay, that's the thing. Yeah. Like that we're starting to develop a language for that sort of work. But I just think it's great because it, you know, it doesn't have to be the only way of writing about literature or our lives, but it opens up, you know, new possibilities. Yeah, and I just think it's an exciting time, and I was just really grateful to have a precedent editor who's here to kind of like see how that could work. And like I said, all these different models of different books that I had read where people were doing that, because I guess I think of it, I mean, the academic word for it would be positionality, that you're trying to see where you fit into this. Like I was just saying there, like these poets were doing, and that cuts both ways. Like I don't think it's straightforward, like, well, I've lived through this thing, therefore I have this expertise and this authority, because it's just as likely to make you biased and kind of like have blind spots. But that back and forth there, like, you know, and Alvarez says this in his book, you know, more than 50 years ago. It takes a subject like suicide, which is sometimes at risk of just becoming statistical and clinical, and it humanizes it, like with the topic, like it has to be like to kind of, and that's what I hoped that these poets could do. Yeah.
But I think the other thing is then, so it's those kind of two modes, but then I think it also makes room for you. By which I mean me and you, and not you in this case, as reader, that there's room, that actually creating that space in between allows you to kind of go. So for instance, I was kind of like recognizing, actually some things I recognize most is, your first encounter with all these kind of literatures on suicide is how often people begin with a declaration of their sort of legitimacy to talk about it. And that legitimacy always seems to come from like having some sort of direct experience of it. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. Because I also felt that instinct when I read the book, and I thought, I'm going to talk to you. I need to, I need to declare. Do you know what I mean? Like that. And but you're right. On the other hand, why does that legitimize anything? And
it's and it's a, it's not. It's an understandable instinct, but I had anytime like where I was in a situation where I needed to talk about, this is what I'm working on, or someone asked with the book, people would inevitably say, oh, do you have personal experience? And I don't think they were like interrogating me, but there was some sense of like, where are you coming from here? And what is this? And I don't think it's a question of like, are you allowed to write about it? But like, where are you coming from? Yeah. What's the kind of context in which, and that, I think it's such an interesting question for like any kind of research or nonfiction writing, because we don't always ask it. In some cases it might be very clear that someone's writing, but there might be lots of topics where it's like, I just find that so fascinating. Like, how did you come? Why is this topic important to you? But it's, like I said, I mean, for me it was. I say this in the book, it was the messiness of my own experience, that it wasn't just like, I lost my sister. I mean, that was obviously like a catalyst, but it was like, I had grown up, with stories about my great-grandmother and then my aunt dying when I was 7, and then others, cousins and others in the family, and I was like, every one of those deaths was so different, and the conversations we had around them was so different, even though they all had the S word attached to them. Like we couldn't reduce them to like, oh, here we go again. It's the exact same. And it's like, no, every single, and that was where, that was a kind of like approach to the thing. I was like, that's why it had to be this global thing. I needed to see like just how broad this goes. And it's like, it was really eye-opening.
Yeah, it's really expansive. I like also chapters like the forest in Japan, which is a real sort of kind of also has its own myth and kind of I mean, that's sort of that's places in my head somehow, and I was kind of like, how did it get there? And you sort of go through where this sort of how this kind of gets communicated to spaces.
Yeah,
aren't there. Yeah, do people
know? Yeah, so Akigahara Forest in Japan it's often known as the suicide forest. And as I talk about it, unfortunately, one of the reasons a lot of people know about it is because a few years ago, Logan Paul, I hate even saying his name. Logan Paul he filmed himself doing a crazy vlog in the forest and filmed a body and posted it on YouTube, and took it down within 24 hours, but there was a huge outcry. And it was I think there was more to that conversation about suicide than just the kind of the ethics of, obviously, like, it was wrong what he did, but it was an interesting kind of question. And there were a group of poets that the BBC commissioned to go into the forest and write about this space, because it is a sacred space, kind of going back. It's at the foot of Mount Fuji, and it's a weird ecological space as well. And it's kind of a weird leap, but in the book I compare it to the Forest of Suicides in Dante's Inferno, which is that's where suicides go in hell in Dante's poem. And it's just, again, it's that idea of like the poem as almost something like a physical space, but as Dante puts it, it's a pathless wood. There's no like, this is the only possible route to get through that space. You can come in it from different sides. You can find different things there. You can be, a sensitive reader and a wanderer like Dante is, and he's talking to, he's so overwhelmed emotionally in that passage. If you know that bit, it's Canto 13. Or you can be Logan Paul, and you can go barreling through that space, and as if it were your own. And it's the ethics of that movement that I'm just thinking.
You talk about the computer game as well. That they do. There's a computer game version of the Inferno, where you, as as Dante,
Yeah,
the version of Dante who can wield a sword, get to judge over the souls. Yeah. But it made me think that game is almost the polar opposite. Recently, we I was speaking to Lorna Goodison here, who's just done a new translation of the Inferno. And I was kind of asking her about, like, well, what's it like to be in that space all the time? Like, I couldn't do it. I have to read the Inferno in chunks, and I couldn't read all of it because I find it so bleak. It's really, it's worth reading, and I've done it a few times, but I also need to take breaks from it. And she really resisted that, though, because I said it must be so much worse for you if you're always in there writing it. And she said, no. She said, I believe there's her word was medicine. There's a medicine in this book, which just made me think of that just now as well. And I think that's also true here.
It's true. I mean, so this very weird video game of the Inferno, but like, it was that, like with the Logan Paul, that this wasn't like, these weren't diversions in the sense of like, oh, now I'm talking about pop culture. But I was really like those connections with poetry and how often that comes in. There's another chapter where I talk about the TV show 13 Reasons Why and the book, and I'm sure a lot of you remember a huge debate around that as well. And they went back and they edited out the death scene from the episode, and kind of like it was, and there have been lots of studies like, did it have a negative impact or a positive impact on young people? But in that show and in the book, like, she's writing poetry. Like, it's a big part of the narrative that she goes to a poetry workshop, and it's a kind of, and there's this whole debate about, you have to like spill your trauma. Like, that's what poetry's for. You have to really like bare your soul. Or can it be constructive? And then they sort of, after she dies, they're looking, is there evidence in the poem that shows what she was thinking? And I just, like, it's such a sign, like kind of poetry not being this thing that's cut off from stuff, but it's already part of this public language around a topic like this, that it's our associations, where it's where we go.
If you're thinking about questions yourself, please let me know. I need to check the time, because I realized I wasn't doing a time check at all. I was getting caught up in the conversation. So I'm going to open it up now.
Well, I was going to say, can I just read the end of that chapter, and you can think of questions then?
That's perfect.
Does that work?
Yeah.
And
that's great.
I don't know why it sort of feels incomplete if I don't give you the kind of... I know I'm leaving out everything in the middle of the chapter where I talk about Plath and Berryman and Sexton and Jarrell. But this is where it ends up. Growing up as twins meant that my sister Sarah and I shared most of our childhood friends. After she died, I phoned one friend I hadn't spoken to in years, who had once known us better than almost anyone else in the world. We caught up happily for over an hour before I could bring myself to say why I was calling. He fell silent for a moment, then asked, did she have any kids? At the time, I chose to interpret this as a practical question. He wanted a clear picture of what our family was dealing with. I see now how his question cuts to the heart of suicide's family bearings. None of us had been through Sarah's house yet, where we would find a notebook that she must have used as part of therapy, and a list of things under the heading, let go of / give up on. She wrote, having children, will not pass on genes, cannot handle parenting, age too risky, pets only, and not too many. Further down the page, she pledged to give up being angry at my genetics. In our broader experiences of suicide, its hereditary dimensions become inseparable from the idea of inheritance that we inherit. The stories we tell ourselves and each other about our place in a larger family story are not myths in the sense of opposing reality, but myths in our ritual-like use of them to connect our histories to our futures, our origins to our sense of fate. When it comes to suicide, I do not believe these story genes are seeds of an inescapable fate. Instead, they provide a foundation for our readings of both death and survival. Joan Didion once wrote, "We tell ourselves stories in order to live." It might be just as true, which is to say just as believable and therefore consequential, that we also tell ourselves stories in order to die. To finish this chapter, it might be worth comparing this way of thinking about suicidal inheritance with the historian Michael Rothberg's concept of multi-directional memory. Rothberg's term, which has been so influential in the study of public memory and historical trauma, emphasizes the entanglements between individual and collective traumas. A multi-directional understanding of trauma in our collective memory can move us beyond what Rothberg calls competitive memory, or our tendency to view shared traumas as separate experiences with separate meanings for separate groups, all competing for attention in public memory. In that sense, multi-directional memory might be thought of as a form of intersectional thinking, in which different trauma experiences overlap and affect each other. And in this light, inheritance suddenly seems much less linear, much more like T.S. Eliot's understanding of the relationship between the past and the present when he writes, "What happens when a new work of art is created is something that happens simultaneously to all the works of art which preceded it." In Rothberg's multi-directional memory, each new trauma affects the reading of all traumas that preceded it. Scaling this understanding of public memory to a family level reveals how an event like a suicide reverberates in all directions simultaneously, reshaping all traumas and stories through which a family understands itself. These reverberations are inevitably messy. My grandmother was furious when my aunt killed herself. Having told the story all her life of losing her mother that way, how could her daughter now do this to her daughters? And when I think of these multi-directional reverberations, my family tree is replaced by an image of a deep, dark pond. I see each death rippling outwards, backwards, and forwards, affecting each person differently on any given day. Other deaths and traumas make new disturbances until the entire pond is marked by interference between these concentric ripples. Each of us does their best to find a meaningful course among them, knowing our stories and readings create their own wake. Like Plath, we make monsters out of fear of becoming one. Like Berryman, we sense the undertow of fate. Like Sexton, we feel it permeate our bodies. Like Jarrell, we circle endlessly in stories. The ripples run deep as inheritance churns back on itself, each loss affecting all others. Whole childhoods and family histories are pulled under by old losses and losses yet to come, the very ones we dread and therefore cannot help but pass on. My sister was holding a locket when she died, containing a picture of her mother. Who can measure its weight for her? Somewhere far beneath the surface, we feel these reverberations in the deepest sense of ourselves.
Thank you so much. I sort of feel like that brings it all together so brilliantly. I'm almost tempted to say there's enough of us to talk afterwards, if that, does that make sense to people? The book, I'm going to do all the bits and then we're going to thank JT properly. The books are for sale. And if I haven't recommended it enough, just one last thing I'd say, it's helped me do important work for myself as well. And I really can't praise it higher than that. Remember, there was the additional information I mentioned. Do pick one up. I really think it's useful for everybody. I mentioned Poets Who Stopped, so a couple of other events. If you're interested in that, we are talking about Laura Riding next, Laura Riding Jackson, which I think is why I started talking about The Telling earlier, The Telling and The Telling, who is interesting company. And that's on Wednesday, May the 27th at 6:30. You can join online, and it'll be a kind of workshop. We tend to read. There's a bit of writing, although not much, and we tend to sort of think about this idea of stopping and what it means about writing. Jean Spracklin will be launching her book, Welsch Maya, here. Her exhibition is up, and I think most of it's still accessible, so please do have a look. And then one of the last events we're doing is at the Edges of Languages with Kaula Badwam on June the 8th, but it's all in the programme. You can borrow books, you can become a member, all these good things. But for now, and you'll get a chance to speak to him, and I'm around as well, to JT, him. You can talk to JT, who I'm sure will also sign copies now. So can you please join me one more time in giving a huge round of applause for JT for that really generous and incredible reading and conversation.
Thank you.